Number 1. Chris Watts. A year after the murders, Chris Watts confessed to killing his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. At the time of the confession, he was already serving 5 life sentences at a prison in Wisconsin. The confessions gave the details of the murder, but with no explanation of why. In August 2018, Shannon Watts, 6 weeks pregnant, learned her 3rd child would be a boy. She and her husband Chris Watts were getting ready for the big announcement, but that day would never come. Shortly after returning from a business trip, a friend reported Shannon as missing. Her children, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, were also gone. During a welfare check, police found all the doors were locked from the inside, and the only access to the house was a door leading to the garage. Chris Watts allowed his home to be searched by police, at which time Shannon's purse, keys and cell phone were retrieved. Despite knowing he was responsible, Watts held news conferences pleading for his family's safe return. It didn't take long for the investigation to focus on Chris Watts as a killer. A neighbor's security camera showed him backing up his pickup truck shortly before his family was reported missing. When interviewed, Watts admitted he had killed his wife and 2 daughters. The night before the murders, Shannon and Chris had an argument in which she had accused him of having an affair. Chris denied the allegations and the couple went to bed. The next morning, the argument started up again. Shannon threatened Chris would never see his children again. That's when Chris got on top of her and strangled her to death. During the killing, 4-year-old Bella entered the room. "What's wrong with Mummy?" she asked. Watts told Bella everything was fine, but her mother was sick and needed to go to the hospital. Watts loaded up his family into his pickup truck. He put Shannon across the floorboards and lifted the 2 girls onto the seats. During a 45-minute drive, the children repeatedly asked about their mother, but Watts assured them she was not feeling well and everything would be fine. Watts parked his truck near an oil field where his company had been working. He pulled Shannon from the truck and lay her on the ground nearby. Next, he scooped up the 3-year-old Celeste and put her next to Shannon. He then proceeded to smother Celeste with a blanket. Returning to the truck, Bella asked if the same thing was going to happen to her. She too was lifted from the truck and smothered to death with a blanket. After a short investigation, Watts told authorities where they would find the bodies. They found Shannon buried in a shallow grave, and the 2 girls thrown into oil tanks. Chris was arrested and later charged with 5 counts of murder, 3 first-degree murder charges, and 2 additional charges for killing children under the age of 12. Additionally, Watts was also charged with unlawfully terminating a pregnancy. Prosecutors, at the request of Shannon's family, did not seek the death penalty. The family told officials there had been enough deaths already. Now knowing the details of the murder, the family says their decision would have been different. "I didn't know I was going to do it," Watts said in his confession. Though he provided no motive for the killings, it is suspected he and his mistress wanted to start a new life with no responsibilities. Watts remains in prison without possibility of parole. Number 2. Helene Brzezinski. In January 1980, 21-year-old Helene Brzezinski's body was discovered by a woman driving next to a field in Douglas County, Colorado. Helene's hands were tied behind her back with nylon straps. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. There was little evidence at the scene. Next to the dirt road, detectives noticed tracks left by a vehicle and footprints. They also took into evidence a milk carton and an old can. After careful processing, none of the evidence proved helpful. Initially, detectives thought the case might be connected with a rape that happened 2 weeks earlier in the same location. Later, this theory was dismissed because Helene had only been in Colorado for 3 weeks and was attacked by a stranger. The following year, the case felt cold and remained unsolved for 40 years. At the time of Helene's murder, the science of DNA didn't exist. The possibility of DNA testing in criminal cases emerged in the early 90s. At that time, a national FBI database of DNA profiles was created. The database stores the DNA profile for known and convicted criminals. The Helene Brzezinski case was reviewed again in 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2013. Each year, the DNA recovered at the 1980 crime scene was run against the FBI database. There were no matches, but that was about to change. In 2018, a woman named Jessie Still was researching her ancestry. She used a commercial service called JetMatch. To use the service, your DNA is uploaded to an open source database in an attempt to find distant relatives. Authorities have also accessed this database to compare DNA profiles from unsolved cases. That's when it happened. That's when there was a lead. Detectives contacted Jessie Still and told her she may have a familial connection to the killer. Police worked their way through Jessie's family tree until they found a man named James Clanton. In 1975, he had been convicted in Arizona for the rape of a woman at knife point and was now living in Florida. James was a distant relative to Jessie Still, linked to her great-great-grandparents. No living relative had any knowledge of James. Even though authorities had information regarding James's past criminal convictions, they needed his DNA to directly link him to the crime. So police traveled to Florida to trace James. They trailed him for several days. Eventually, James was located at a pub where he was enjoying a couple of beers. When he left for home, police grabbed the beer mug and processed it for his DNA. It was a match for the DNA that they found at the 1980 crime scene. Next, it was time to talk to Clanton. Detectives called Clanton in for an interview, telling him they were investigating a fraud case and he might have information to help solve the crime. James Clanton agreed to this interview. During Clanton's interview, detectives told him they were not investigating fraud, but it was a homicide. They showed Clanton a photograph of Helene and explained his DNA was a match to the DNA found on her body. He denied any involvement in the murder. After hours of being interviewed, Clanton cracked. He told detectives he had killed Helene. According to James, he had forced Helene at knife point into a shed. After tying her up, he sexually assaulted her and stabbed her 9 times and threw her dead body in the nearby field. James Clanton was arrested and charged with murder and kidnapping. Clanton accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for this, his sentence of the death penalty was reduced to life in prison. It was the research of a family tree, the uploading of DNA, and the discovery of an unknown relative that solved a 40-year-old case. Number 3. Angie Dodge. On the morning of June 13th, 1996, sometime after 11, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was raped and brutally murdered in her apartment. When Angie didn't show up for work, colleagues reported her missing. Investigators began processing the crime scene. Semen and hairs were found on Angie's body. DNA profiling indicated the evidence had come from a single unknown suspect. Detectives maintained a theory that the murder may have involved 2 or more individuals. After investigating Angie's friends and colleagues, detectives focused on a 20-year-old man named Christopher Tapp. Although Tapp's DNA didn't match that found at the scene, investigators believed he was involved in the murders. Over the weeks that followed, detectives questioned Tapp for a total of 28 hours, leading to his eventual confession of having been there when Dodge was killed. Tapp told detectives that he and a couple of friends were visiting Angie at her new apartment. He said an argument broke out, and he held Angie down, and his friend started stabbing her. Christopher Tapp was arrested and charged with rape and murder in the first degree. After 13 hours of deliberation, a jury found Tapp guilty. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. Following Tapp's conviction, police continued to search for the individual who had done the stabbing. Tapp claimed his confession was false. He said that detectives had coerced him into saying he was involved in the murder. During the questioning, detectives kept feeding him details of the crime. These were details Tapp didn't know. Investigators administered 7 different polygraphs, and during the test, threatened him with the gas chamber and maintained their belief in his guilt. Through a plea deal, Christopher Tapp's sentence was suspended and he was released from prison. The conviction for rape was removed, but the murder charge would remain on his record. By this time, Tapp had spent more than 20 years in prison, despite his DNA never having been found at the crime scene. In 2019, police finally got a match for the murder. The DNA gathered from the 1996 crime scene matched that of Brian Dripps. Without any doubt, he murdered Angie Dodge. He pleaded guilty to the murder and said no one else was there during the deadly stabbing. Christopher Tapp, who at the time still had a murder conviction on his record, was fully exonerated. Brian Dripp will be sentenced in April 2021.